no matter what the obstacle was, whether it was feeding children, building the first nursing home in the city of Chicago, establishing a religious community. All the odds were really against her, but she persevered in spite of all those difficulties.
Reaching out to the poor in Chicago at that time, she saw that as a basic need in her front yard, and if she could make a difference, she would, and she did.
She didn't say, I need to make more money and then I'm going to do this. It was, this is my talent. I will use my talent to do this work for God.
She said, I felt the misery and suffering of others, and she needed to do something about it.
From miracle workers to martyrs, to those ordinary people living extraordinary lives of heroic virtue. These are the people that make us wonder if someday they might be saints. Josephine Dudzik was born the third of 6 children to John and Agnes Dudzik on August 30th, 1860, in Plochich, Poland, a village so small that it didn't even have a Catholic church. Even as a child, she loved going to church and couldn't stand to hear about somebody suffering without her responding. She would be moved to help beggars that she encountered, but her parents made her promise for her safety and well-being of the family that she would not give them any money. But she found a way to sneak coins to the poor. She babysat children so mothers could more easily go to Mass, shared her lunch at school, and took the spare loaf of bread to the sick neighbor. When she would later earn her own income as a seamstress, she would buy medicines for the sick too.
When I think of Mother Mary Theresa, the stories of her and her compassionate heart would lend a person to believe that when anyone would encounter her, or she, more importantly, would encounter another person, that she would go out to them, that she would embrace them, and she would want to take care of them, because her heart was just so filled with a need to want to be able to care for other people.
This was a woman who I would call, we talk about incarnational spirituality. In other words, she was fully imbued with the life of Christ. I think even by the time she came to Chicago when she was, I believe she was 21 years old at the time, but already, I would say first and foremost, even over and above her work with the poor and the destitute and the elderly, she was very much a woman of God, had already declared that her life was going to be given to God.
About a decade after the Great Chicago Fire, the Dudziks immigrated to the United States in 1881.
When Poland got divided into Russia, Prussia, and Austria, people didn't, their culture was being threatened. Their language was being closed down. And it was difficult to try and make ends meet. And so people were looking for a better life. And slowly they found their way to America. There's a word in Polish that they use for the immigrants, za chleba, which means for bread. Bread was a staple of life. And for the Polish community, if you didn't have bread, literally and figuratively, you were in sad straits. And they were in sad straits, and that's why many of them upped and left. Not only because they couldn't survive under the circumstances of the partitions that took place in Poland in the late 1700s, but also then the land was poor.
With their faith being oppressed, with their language and their culture being oppressed, it was not a good place to be. So unless you were bowing over unto the other group, you were getting nowhere. And so they had glowing letters. Some of the older members of the family had already immigrated here and sent back glowing letters. Oh, jobs in plenty, everything wonderful here. You've got to come over. You know, leave all that hardship over there. Plus, we could speak Polish over here. And there's a Catholic church nearby. And they have masses in Polish. It's just like being at home, but being free.
The church was a very important part to many of the immigrants because they came from very hard times in Europe. The reason that many of them left Europe was because of they came from poverty, rural poverty areas, and they were seeking a better life.
She was an immigrant that came to a strange country, not knowing the language. When she came over, everything had to be new. She had to start over. And to me, that really takes a lot of courage.
Everyone of all ethnic groups, Polish, Irish, German, Italian, you name it, Czechs, everybody, came because the city needed to be rebuilt and they were looking for cheap labor. But people realized that if they wrote home and told the people that there were jobs available, they would come, and they did.
12 years later, Chicago still teemed with the same hope and poverty as when they arrived. Some people saw their dreams of American prosperity realized, while others found just more work that left them tired, poor, and dirty.
She came with the skill of sewing, and at that time, that was a premium skill. People just didn't go to the store and buy things off the rack as readily as we do today. Actually, she had a nice little business going.
Her customers were the women on the Gold Coast of Chicago. And so Josephine, at the time as she was known, she would create these beautiful dresses.
While her siblings left for convents or to start their own families, she provided for herself and her elderly parents in comfortable independence as a seamstress.
She would encounter people on the street out in front of her home and down the street and on her way there that were cold, that were poor, that were hungry, that didn't have a lot. Chicago at the time, the population had just exploded. And as she would walk by people, there was something that stirred in her heart that said, I cannot walk by and not help them. And so eventually she began to take food from her own table out to the people that she encountered. Eventually, in the cold Chicago winter, she would bring them into her home. And eventually, as that got to be way too much, she herself tried to figure out, how can I best do this?
She wanted to help the people who were older, who were poor, and who were suffering because of the economic poor times in the Chicagoland area, especially with the Poles. In the late 1800s, there was about 15,000 Poles in Chicago, but about 1920, there was 115,000 Poles. And so she had her work cut out for her.
It had to be the largest Polish community in the world. She was a daily communicant, went to Mass daily, and immediately got involved in the life of the parish in various sodalities. She was a Third Order Franciscan, worked in the rectory, worked in the sacristy. When she wasn't home, she was in the church.
So she was involved in a number of sodalities. She helped out with what we would call today the Altar Rosary Sodality, and then there were some devotional sodalities that she was a part of. And for many of the immigrants, their life really revolved around the church. That was not only their religious life, but also their spiritual life and their social life.
She was always dedicated to the church. She was always coming here, even before she began being a nun. She was somebody who would bring older people, poor people, to her parents' home so that they could be taken care of. This was in her early years. You know, she was early 20s. She wasn't a sister yet. Her mother was not very happy initially with her bringing these people, and she would explain, well, Mom, this person's sickly or poor or whatever, and her mother would just kind of wave her head and say, okay, come on back in. And she finally eventually got used to the idea, and she began helping her daughter.
She did what every, in that time, good Catholic was doing, but she wanted to do more. She wanted to make a difference. She felt called to look at the needs that were in that parish, what was needed at that time, and how she could fulfill it.
Her father died young, so it was her and her mother, and she continued to, follow in her mission.
As Josephine sat sewing into the night, humming to herself, she also imagined a house. In it lived the elderly abandoned by their children who had gone west, childless widows, people crippled by polio, and children born with handicaps. Josephine imagined herself making their beds and gathering them together for prayers.
I think coming from Poland and being an immigrant, she knew what it meant to suffer and not have, and I think that's what prompted her in many ways to start her ministry, trying to meet the basic needs.
She just, I thought, exemplified and manifested all the heroic traits that not only in her life as a religious, but the way she lived her life and how she transformed the whole concept of care for the elderly and the handicapped, and in a time where it was almost like something out of Dickens, with workhouses and people abandoning these the marginalized. And Mother Theresa Dudzik just said, "Give them to me. I'll find a way to care for them." And I thought, that's a hero.
She could have had an easy life, a comfortable life, been a church-going holy woman all by herself, and she didn't need to embark on this adventure. But it was an adventure that really caused her a lot of sacrifice.
She had to figure out how to take the resources that she had, which were very meager resources, and be able to feed people and care for people and use the funds that she was able to get to care for as many people the best ways that she could.
How to accomplish this dream had come to her at prayer the week before. Why not invite her fellow tertiary Franciscans to purchase a large house together, where they could care for these poor people and pray? She also knew several pious women in the parish, some of whom had even spent several years in religious life, who could teach them about prayer and union with God. She took this idea to her good friend and fellow Franciscan, Rose Wyszynski, and Rose was enthusiastic, even though she knew she would not be able to join initially because she was already caring for her elderly parents and mute sister. Josephine presented her idea to the tertiaries at their meeting that first Sunday in October. Everyone thought it was excellent, and some, like Josephine, wanted to start right away. Rose, less naive, proposed that they each pray about it for a year to discern God's will before launching into it. Now Josephine had to approach Father Barzinski. He was supportive and had been concerned about the appearance of her as an unmarried woman taking care of men in her home. Therefore, his only one requirement to give his full approval: the women had to adopt religious life, including vows and a habit. He believed it was the only way they could give the work a firm foundation and lasting future. Josephine had a holy fear of the commitment of religious life, but she reasoned that God would help her. With the priest's guidance, the women started to bring their plans to fruition. Instead of renting or buying a house in Chicago, Father Barzinski directed them to build a new house in Avondale, then outside of Chicago. For the time being, they should move into one of their homes for a 6-month trial period. As Josephine's home was the largest, they decided it would be hers.
She took all of the elderly that were abandoned, and she took them to care for them in her own home. She didn't rent a place. She didn't find another place where she could help out. She took them into her own home. What that said to me was total dedication. She was a single woman. She was at risk of somebody robbing her or taking advantage in various ways. But she thought, if I trust in God and I do this ministry that He's asking me, it's going to be okay. It's going to work out.
She was up against insurmountable odds, and she didn't have the wherewithal to care, but she still did it. So I thought she was a woman of great intelligence. I thought she was a woman of great courage, not only spiritual courage up against these odds, because it was a time when Catholics were still marginalized in our culture. And she literally, she was also a visionary and literally pioneered so much of what we take for granted today in terms of how the most vulnerable and marginalized people are cared for.
So she connected with a priest, Father Brzezinski, who gave her guidance and direction, and gathered with some other women and established the first nursing home in the city of Chicago. And it wasn't a little place, it was a big place.
Father Vincent Brzezinski, he was one who in the Chicago area really felt a need or an understanding of how the church really needed to be built up. He knew that the people that he was ministering to, or the people of Chicago even as a whole, really needed to have an example of what it is to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. And what better example than to have a religious group of sisters.
Father Brzezinski was her spiritual director, and I think at the beginning he supported her wholeheartedly. He started the confraternity at the parish for the women, which eventually grew into the community. But he also was a realist, I think.
Father Brzezinski had no illusions about the undertaking Josephine had on her hands. He interviewed each of the young women himself to make sure they were fully aware of what they were getting themselves into. He gave special attention to their leader, Josephine. Did she realize what difficulties she would face in forming these women into a religious community? In serving the poor, in gaining the support they would need from the community? Now, when enthusiasm was high, everything seemed easy. But she was subjecting herself to every potential criticism and trial, and she could not abandon the project she had started. He told her that she must promise that she will care for this community, not only in times of prosperity, but also when difficulties beset it from all sides. Josephine promised.
Not only did she figure out, number one, that she wanted to do this, but then how to staff it, how to feed people, how to care for people, how to organize this big building, which was really an incredible accomplishment for a person at her time.
Mother Teresa's main virtue might be that of total trust in God. She had embarked on this ministry totally as a call. That's something that God wanted her to do.
On the Solemnity of the Immaculate Conception on December 8, 1894, Father Brzezinski blessed the assembled group and declared it their formal foundation day.
I think she probably approached it with mixed emotions. I'm sure the high point was that she was dedicating her life to the Lord, and it was formalized and recognized by the church, and hopefully a grace-filled moment for her. But I think being the human side of her is like, what is really going on here? Because I don't think she anticipated starting a religious community.
One by one, they moved into Josephine's home over the month of December. They elected Josephine their superior and assumed the religious names they had received when they had first become Franciscan tertiaries, though they still wore lay clothes. Josephine became known as Sister Teresa. They celebrated that Christmas in a spirit of joy and ease and freedom that Josephine thought would never end. Sister Teresa and Sister Angelina continued their work as seamstresses, plus sewing vestments and altar linens for the church and managing the regular housework. Sisters Frances, Hyacinth, Joachim, and Felixa took on the washing and cleaning for the church and rectory, which they were paid monthly for. Also, they followed a daily communal routine, waking at 4:30 a.m. for morning prayer and Mass. Sister Theresa went home happy, but the honeymoon was over for the forming community. Sister Hyacinth had become convinced that Sisters Teresa and Angelina were relaxing at home with their easy needlework, while the other three broke their backs doing laundry for 30 priests. She said nothing to Sister Teresa, though, but instead complained to her fellow laundresses. The discontent so infected Sister Frances that it oozed out one morning in an angry vent to Sister Agnes. Sister Teresa could hear the yelling in the kitchen and went in to find her mother on the verge of tears. Sister Teresa reminded the others that the needlework required special training over the course of years, but as her reasoning fell on deaf ears, she reassigned herself to laundry duty to give a good example and keep the peace. She gave Sister Hyacinth the sewing and household chores that she had been doing. The quality of the sewing work predictably tailed off dramatically, resulting in angry clientele who threatened to pull their business. The community needed this income. There were simply no other well-paying jobs for women at this time. So after some deep prayer, Sister Teresa rearranged the work schedule and took back her old job with her old clients and added to her already full schedule with additional hours of doing laundry.
There was nothing that she wouldn't do because she believed in her mission, she believed in the mission, and she believed the Lord was with her and that she was doing the Lord's work. So if it meant doing the laundry, we did the laundry. And if it meant cleaning the church, we cleaned the church. And if it meant ringing doorbells and asking for food, that's what she did. So I think, it's not something that should be considered beneath her. It's just something that she was willing to do for the good of the order and good of the mission they were on.
She was willing to trade places with others. And so she just did whatever it was to maintain peace and keep people moving toward her goal of caring for all these elderly people. So that impressed me so much that she was willing to dedicate her entire life, not just part of it.
She took the harder jobs because some of the other sisters either didn't feel like they were called to do that, or it was so hard that they didn't want to do them. But she chose those roles. She chose to do that. And I picture her working so hard day and night, lifting these heavy sheets out of the bins that they would have to use to wash them, and the water was hot. It wasn't these nice little washing machines where you press a button. It was hard work, and she did it because she wanted to make sure people lived in the dignity that they deserved.
She believed in her work, she was constant in her work, and she continued to show the sisters and to show the young sisters especially what it was to be a follower of Christ and how important it was to be obedient to superiors.
She never gave up, no matter how tough things got. She saw a need during an extremely difficult time, and she answered that call. She took care of people when no one else would. And if it was tough, she didn't think about herself. She thought about that person. I found that to be tremendously admirable. And it affects you. I like to think that I'm a compassionate person myself, but never to that self-sacrificing level. That's what makes her a saint, is that she went above and beyond what a normal person would do in the circumstances.
Whatever the Lord gave her, she just used it, as another opportunity to move on forward and be creative in different ways.
In 1897, work on the new building was underway. In the meantime, the women had moved into a larger apartment where they could better care for more elderly and disabled persons. There were years of hard work between the laundry, the sewing, the planning, and the caretaking. But Sister Teresa never felt completely spent. She looked forward every day to the evening prayers with the residents, who had at first been indifferent to prayer. Soon she hoped they would have a proper chapel to pray in. In the spring of 1898, Sister Theresa and the community moved in St. Joseph's home for the aged and invalids. Rose Wazinski, who had accompanied Sister Theresa in spirit and in planning the building, finally joined them as Sister Anna, making the aspiring religious seven. Their situation was more precarious than ever, even as their number of charges increased. Sister Theresa placed her trust in God. Their material needs she entrusted to St. Joseph, and she had already known that God would supply her soul, even here, far from any church. And so, donations came when least expected, and they moved even closer to taking the Franciscan habit. In the years that followed, the Franciscan Sisters of Blessed Cunegunda, later renamed the Franciscan Sisters of Chicago, stabilized and grew, and Mother Mary Teresa's virtues and charismatic inspiration that founded the community would receive their due recognition. In 1900, she was made novice mistress and re-elected superior in 1909.
Many, many, many years ago, Mother Mary Theresa founded a religious congregation of women. And the group that she started with had many transitions, many challenges. The spirit of Mother Mary Theresa followed in all the women that followed her, and in what is now known of as the Franciscan Sisters of Chicago.
The community was a vivacious community. I mean, they were everywhere and doing everything, and very dedicated and concerned and loving women who loved the Lord and were willing to serve. And if you look at some of the stories of the sisters, I mean, they started out as a teacher, then they wound up as a nurse, and then they wound up doing this, and where the need was, they went.
We, as Franciscan Sisters of Chicago, consider Mother Teresa as great in the sense that we're inspired by her. We follow her charism. We follow her dedication, her idea of service. When Mother Teresa opened her doors of her own home for the senior citizens, that was something very unique at that time. And that's what can inspire us now. We have also continued that ministry of the care of the elderly. And actually, we've gone full circle, because here at Our Lady of Victory Convent, we have opened the doors of our convent for the senior citizens. Our first floor of Our Lady of Convent is now open to men and women, elderly men and women, and we give them care. We share the dining room together, we share the chapel together. So in that sense, we're very close to what Mother Teresa did.
Our vision in Franciscan Ministries is taken from the Gospel of John 10:10, which is when Jesus said, "I have come that you might have life and have it in abundance." We believe that at all ages of life, we're not just called to survive, we're called to thrive, we're called to have the fullness of life. And it's our hope that in our communities that is a lived reality. It is our hope and our expectation, and I believe most of the time we succeed at this is treating every person with dignity, respect, and the care and compassion that Mother Mary Theresa would have had. And this is true of our independent living residents who are traveling and really living their best life, and also people with the greatest challenges of aging, to have them live in the fullness of life that God wants for all people, but also that she tried to instill in her communities that she served in.
Mother Teresa, she lived during a time when people were very poor. There was another depression going on. There were people who were living in the streets. These are not things that have ever really gone away. There are still people who need help, and there are still people that need to respond to that call and to recognize it. I see today's world as being pretty self-focused. There's not enough people that are wanting to do things for people who are needy, and we need to recognize that. We need more people like Mother Teresa that recognize that and take it upon themselves to actually do something, not just sit there and talk about it, but do something.
The charisms and the virtues and the example she led could be very helpful today, not only for praying for miracles and things like that, but also just, as we live out our baptismal call, how do we do that, because she found a way to minister to the people in their need at that time. I mean, she was a poor immigrant woman from Poland, and she had a lot of difficulties in forming this community, and she, didn't let it take, she found ways to get around it. And she, staying up all night sewing and doing laundry, that's what she did, and so that becomes a great example.
I find inspiration in Mother Theresa Dudzik because in my vocation as an iconographer, and I'm also an author and I write about the saints, it is not the mystical manifestations, miraculous occurrences. It's in the slugging out of the day-to-day mundane, in which I really believe it was the crucible for the saints' sanctity. And I think that was the case with Mother, and that's something that I can identify with, and many people can identify with, because what did she do on a daily basis? That she prayed, she went to Mass, but at the same time, she was also trying to find money. She was dealing with personal health issues. She was dealing with founding a community and running a community. And then on top of that is this tsunami of people in need, and she had to find a way to deal with that. So she trusted. I mean, it wasn't a taffy pull for her by any means. Every day was a struggle, just like us.
When our sisters come and visit our communities, one of the things that they frequently say is, what would Mother Mary Theresa say about this community? And I think, first of all, I think she would be utterly amazed, because part of our vision for Franciscan ministries is our communities are beautiful. They're places where residents and their families would love to come and be, because they really speak to living in this fullness of life. I think that she would be amazed at the number of people, nursing people, dining people, people in administration, pastoral care people, that have taken really her vision and really brought it to life in ways that I'm sure at the time she had absolutely no concept it could ever grow into. I think that she would be very inspired by the work that people do. I think as our sisters look at the work that they have been called to do and how they have really passed it on to the next generation that follows and the generations after that, I think that she would be inspired by them, because they have busy lives, they work, have kids. We're obviously coming out of a very challenging time in our world with COVID and all that, but that people still have this incredible commitment to care for other people. I think that would inspire her as she inspired other people so many years ago.
We as a community have really tried to keep hospitality alive among us and for others. So we always try to keep that as a main objective, something that we continue to do, something we could take pride in, no matter how old we are, no matter how frail we are. It doesn't matter. You can always be hospitable. And I think her kindness and her thoughtfulness at that time inspires us to do the same.
She was diagnosed with cancer in 1915, and through her illness kept busy and followed the community schedule. Father Andrew Spetz, who had become the community's spiritual director after the death of Father Barzinski, ordered Sister Theresa to write a memoir of the founding and first years of the community. This became the Chronicle.
She only wrote her chronicle, which is the story of starting the Franciscan Sisters of Chicago, because her spiritual director asked her to do that. And so we have this treasure that we have in her own words, everything that she went through in order to make that happen.
For a number of good months, where she suffered, where she needed to be in bed all the time, where sisters would come to take care of her during the long days and long nights. And despite the fact that she was in an awful lot of pain, one of the key things that she always did was asked how the sisters were doing and what was going on within the community and their work. She was very interested to know that the sisters were being faithful to their call, but she was also very interested in knowing how the sisters were doing themselves. She was, in many ways, a very good mother to her sisters, taking care of them even in her weakest moments and her dying moments. She is a woman of humility, a woman of grace, and a woman of great care and love for her fellow, not just sisters, but for her fellow humans.
Mother Theresa Dudzik died of cancer at the age of 58 on September 20th, 1918.
I think the local attitude towards Mother Teresa in her life and after her death was that if they didn't have the language of faith, a lot of the people, they would have said, this woman has something. She's doing something extraordinary that we don't have the powers to do. She's doing it on faith with no money, no homes, and she's still taking all these marginalized people and handicapped children. And I think that there was great respect for her.
One of the main characteristics of Mother Mary Theresa, in addition to compassion, in my opinion, would be her perseverance. If you've heard her story or understand some of her story, everything in her story would indicate that she should not have been able to accomplish everything that she did. But she had this conviction in her heart that she must do what she was called to do, which is care for people in need. And everything in her story would say, you know, every obstacle was against her, but she figured out how to do it.
The cause for canonization of Sister Mary Theresa Dudzik was opened in 1960.
My position is to be the promoter of the cause. The promoter of the cause is going to answer any of the correspondence between Rome and the local place, which in our case is the Franciscan Sisters of Chicago here in Lamont.
The whole beatification thing started much later after her death. I don't know if they, when you're living in the present with people, you don't realize, the sanctity and the holiness of people. She was a very dedicated nun who did a lot of, but I think as people started sharing the story and looking more into her life and her history, and the sisters became more involved. I think, they took it on as a cause. When you're in the midst of it in the 1800s, she's just one of us, but as they, the stories were shared and things like that. Bishop Alfred Abramovich, he grew up in St. Pancratius Parish in Chicago. He was the auxiliary bishop here in Chicago. Deep love for Polonia, but also a deep love for Mother Teresa because he grew up with the sisters. He would be the champion of the cause. He would go around, promoting it and sharing it. He was involved in the exhumation, and he was involved in the, the bringing here, and then the whole process with Cardinal Cody to start the process of her, looking into her saintly qualities to see if she would be, and then it continued on until his death. So it was helpful to have, an in-house bishop, if you say that, because he grew up with the sisters.
There are 4 stages in the canonization process. First, when the cause opens, the candidate is termed a servant of God. Next, when their life of heroic virtue has been established, they are named venerable. When a first miracle is validated by Rome, they become blessed. And a second miracle results in them being named a saint.
The sisters have been praying so long for this moment, wishing so long for this moment, doing everything they can to spread the cause, even though there's only 16 members left in Mother Teresa's order. And we're still continuing it, though, with wonderful lay people.
As our community diminishes in numbers, our ministry is growing more as there is a need, and we are able to fulfill that need because of the love we have for Mother Teresa and the love she had for the seniors. So if we imitate her, then we will continue in this ministry.
She was declared venerable in 1994 by Pope John Paul II with the recognition of her heroic charity.
At the time that Mother Teresa was called venerable by the late Pope John Paul II, I received that news with great joy because as a citizen of the city for most of my life, I had heard of Mother Teresa, and I thought, wow, somebody that comes from Chicago is being recognized by the Holy Father, but more so by the church itself. So I was surprised, but very, very happy.
I had no idea that someone from the very community that I live in was potentially, not only potentially, but on her way to becoming a saint, and it was very impressive to me.
When we got word back from Pope John Paul II in March of 1992 that he had accepted it and she was now venerable, our hearts nearly burst with joy. We sisters could barely contain ourselves. Our own foundress, one of our sisters, venerable. What a joy.
The cause has received many reports of seemingly miraculous intercessions, graces, and blessings through prayers to Venerable Mary Theresa Dudzik.
The kind of things that we hear, from simple things all the way up to really big things.
2 miracles found through her intercession and validated by Rome will lead to her beatification and then canonization. The miracles must be medical healings of a serious condition not liable to go on its own. The cure must be instantaneous, complete, and lasting. And perhaps most difficult of all, there could be no medical treatment that relates to the cure. One remarkable story of the intercessory power of Venerable Mother Theresa Dudzik relates to the instantaneously halting of a renal failure of a man named John Ruskowski.
My dad and I, and my parents in general, we had such a very tight relationship. There's a certain unique relationship between a priest and his parents, and so those are the ones that taught me how to love. They taught me how to pray. They taught me how to be a man of God.
He went into a huge renal failure later that year and went to his physician, Dr. Blaha, and doctor said to him, "You have a limited time to live. You know, I'm sorry to say, maybe 6 months."
He had congestive heart failure, which led to a lot of fluid coming down into his stomach and his abdomen area, which also then affected the kidneys and eventually led to the kidneys starting to shut down.
Luckily, he's had his son, a priest in the Diocese of Peoria, Father Don Ruskowski, seated next to him to support him through that bad news.
How he accepted that was just a wonderful gift to me. And because of his courage and strength, made me stronger. The Catholic paper in Peoria is called the Catholic Post, and a number of years ago, they had an ad with Mother's picture in it, and then he recalled all the stories that his mom told him and his dad.
And he sees the picture of Mother Teresa. "This is it," he says. "This is it. Mother Teresa, you're going to help me. I'm taking you and I'm putting you right in my shirt pocket. You're right over my heart."
My grandmother, my dad's mom, was a very devout lady and lived not too far away from where Mother was doing her ministry. My grandparents would have, and relatives would have recognized her and as somebody holy and as a saint. And he says, "That's the answer. I'm going to use her as an intercessor for this struggle that I'm having.
And I'm asking you to have a heart for my wife. I want to live to care for my wife. You can take me right after she dies, but let me live long enough to care for her, to love her, and to free up your son whom you called to the priesthood."
Before the prayers of the rosary, he would ask her for her intercession. And Dad was very focused on the fact that she would answer his prayers. He always was desperately wanting to know if his prayers were being heard.
A couple weeks later, he has another visit with Dr. Blaha. So his son takes time off, drive him to the doctor, Doctor comes out, looks at the charts, and he says, I don't know how to explain this to you.
The doctor was amazed, and he couldn't prove it, couldn't figure out a way how that happened. He just said, John, I don't know how this happened, but your kidneys are working far better than they were just last week. And so Dad was just elated, just absolutely breath taken away, smiling and jolly and excited.
He said, everything is halted. Nothing is progressing. Your condition's not moving on. I don't know. Somehow you're in remission. There's been no medicine given to you to do this. There's been nothing I can explain. John looked at Don. They knew. They knew. They knew. So the doctor wrote a letter to the family telling him there was no medical explanation for this.
And he kind of sat back and he got a little grin on his face and he says, thank you. Thank you, Mother. I was laughing. I was laughing, you see. God is good all the time, huh? Definitely saw her in an even brighter light than he did before. And he was so wanting to share the story. He contacted the sisters here and he got documentation from the doctor. He reached out, and every time he would talk to me, he says, you're a priest, you need to talk about her. And he had a little picture of her right by his bedside that Sister provided. And he was he would kind of take the picture and give her a little kiss every night. My mom was struggling with Alzheimer's disease. And Dad was a man who he promised my grandfather that he would take care of her to the day she died. And that was kind of his purpose in life, to be that wonderful man to love my mom.
John cared for his wife, and she passed away peacefully.
I totally believe and trust that Mother Dudzik was there to intercede for my dad as he was working with taking care of my mom.
And about 2 weeks later, after he had buried her, had seen her monument, completed his affairs with his son, peacefully passed to death to join Mother Teresa in heaven.
I do believe that she is in heaven and a great intercessor.
Someday, when she advances along the path from servant of God, venerable, blessed, and finally to saint, Mother Theresa Dudzik will go down as one of the great American saints in the history of the Catholic Church.
Curiously, I think that even though she is a local, someone that we venerate locally, I think it would have great impact on the universal church, because what it does is it's showing out of this sort of extraordinary ordinariness of the daily lives of which we are called to. She's adding something to the great symphonic note of the universality of the church. And almost as if Mother Teresa does it there, someone will do it somewhere in Africa or Asia or somewhere else in the United States. So I think that is the great benefit of Mother's canonization, not only Chicago, but again, the universal church, as an example.
Despite all the difficulties, she made a decision in her life to follow Christ even more closely so that she can proclaim that gospel not only in word, but more importantly in deed. And she was able to inspire other young women to join her in that journey of love for fellow people. I think she's a prime example of modern day sainthood.
Francis of Assisi often spoke of perfect joy. And perfect joy doesn't mean we're happy all the time. Perfect joy is a deep sense that no matter what happens, God is with us. And what we do out of a love for God. And her whole life is an example of that value.
Yes, I do think Mother Teresa Dudzik is a saint. I think, although she has not been recognized officially by the Church as a saint, what she did in and through her life made a difference in so many people's lives and affected so many people and brought faith to so many people.
Writing about Mother Mary Theresa, learning about her life, has reinforced my own faith. We tend to get very wrapped up in all the pressures that we have on us today. And even though we may still make time to go to church and to follow our faith, it may not be as much a part of the daily life because we're trying to live that to the best of our ability. I think that knowing her now the way I do and following her life and how she lived it has made me a better person and a better Christian and a better Catholic.
I first became acquainted with Mother Theresa Dudzik when I was volunteering at Port Ministries on the south side of Chicago. And the Franciscan friar, Father Gus, had a big icon of Mother Teresa. And I thought, of Calcutta? He's like, no. This is our very own Mother Teresa.
Her entire life was totally focused on the care of the elderly. She put herself aside for them. And to me, when you put yourself aside for somebody else and you are of service to them totally, then you are a saint.
Absolutely, I believe Mother Teresa is a saint. If anybody's a saint, that woman is a saint. The way she treated people, the way she dealt with adversity in her life.
I do believe that Mother Theresa Dudzik is a saint. There's no doubt in my mind, yeah, she's a saint. She is a saint.
Of course she is. There's no question in my mind. Because what is sainthood except what the Second Vatican Council reminds us of? We're all called to holiness. We're all called to live out the gospel message. She lived it. She put faith into practice. And that becomes the gospel message being unfolded, being a witness to others, that what Christ did for us out of love, gave his life for us, because what more can one do than give his life for one's friends? What more can we do then for one another, except give ourselves over in service for one another? She gave of herself in service to the community that she found was in dire need.
I think saints are people that call us to look at how we can live our best life and how we can totally put our trust in God and to follow God's plan for our life.
This has been They Might Be Saints. I'm Michael O'Neill. Thanks for watching.